We should get going. Okay, let's kill the lights. Is everybody seated, ready to go? Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, the great masters of the human figure from 500 years ago in the Renaissance. But what about our current masters of the human figure? Kurt Swan's Superman, Carmine Infantino's Adam Strange, Jack Kirby's Black Bolt. His figures were as godlike as they were manlike. Kirby, who is our comic book god of creation, just like Michelangelo. Michelangelo, who had his Pietà. But what about Kirby's Pietà? What about the great comic artists like Wally Wood? And of course, Steve Ditko's Spider-Man. I will put up Michelangelo's David against Neil Adams' Superman as the greatest example of the human figure. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to art and comic book art. My name is Arlen Schumer. I'm the author and designer of this book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. In past conventions and academic and college areas, I've lectured on the graphic design of comic book art. 2 years ago, I lectured on illustration in comic book art. And last year at the San Diego Comic Convention, I debuted art and comic art. This is my first time doing it on the East Coast. It was prompted by an article in Vanity Fair a couple years ago in which they elected the greatest artists of our time. And of course, it was the usual suspects: Richard Sierra, Bruce Neiman, Gerhard Richter, Cindy Sherman, Jasper Johns. But of course, there was no comic book artist on this list. Rob Imes, who runs the Ditko Mania comic site, said, what, Steve Ditko doesn't deserve to be on that list? And what about Joe Kubert, who did his version of that great Ditko image? Kubert, who was of course, like all the great comic artists, influenced by the great comic strip artists, like Hal Foster, who did Tarzan. He was one of the three great realistic artists of the comic strip. Here was one of the early collections of comic strips into a comic book. But when you want to talk about comics and art, how far back do you want to go into human history itself? I mean, you can go all the way back to the cave paintings of Lascaux if you want to see sequential images that tell a story. A couple of 100,000 years later, you've got the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Sequential, cartoon-like images. Look at the sequential motion in the third tier of the woman. You add these to the cuneiforms, the verbal images of the Egyptian lore, and you've got what we recognize as sequential, comic book style images to tell a story. Recently on the internet, you can find artwork like this that actually pokes fun at this idea, but really, these Egyptian hieroglyphics are our early comics. Flash forward another couple of thousand years, and you've got medieval manuscripts, the illuminated manuscripts, which tell basically adventure stories of daring do, and some godlike things thrown in as well. And you've got text and image telling a dynamic story. Eventually, this evolved into the Renaissance and Christian and classical artwork that tells the story of Christ's life in sequential panels. A couple of hundred years later, you've got the European broadsides that told stories either of current events or biblical. Then you have Rudolf Topfer, who is a Swiss artist that did what many consider the first graphic novel, called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, in the middle of the 19th century. And he starts to do sequential graphic images with text added. Then a couple of decades later, you have the early comic strip, Richard Outcault and the Yellow Kid, This is from 1896. And you can see the beginnings of word balloons, excuse me, and sequential images. A couple of years later, he adds the firm panel grids that make what we recognize as the comic strip form. Maybe Winsor McCay, who did Little Nemo, is considered one of the greatest artists of our time and took the early comic strip and gave it worlds and dimensions that to this day have never really been duplicated. I mean, study this page and you can see how he made two different worlds come to life. The real world as we know it in those top tiers, and then the fantasy world. This was what many consider the golden age of the comic strip in the 1920s and 1930s. This is Lionel Feininger, who later became a fine art painter, but these were his early comics. Then, of course, you have George Herriman's Crazy Cat manipulating the space of the page and creating a distinct comic strip world that to this day, again, nobody has duplicated. This fantasy world was in direct converse relation to the very realistic worlds of the comic strips of the 1930s, which came to dominate the field, the realistic adventure strips. Hal Foster, after he did Tarzan, left to own his own strip, which became Prince Valiant, where on the giant Sunday comic strip page, he could really explode the space and come up with new forms of dynamism. Then you've got the second greatest realistic artist, Milton Caniff, who did Terry and the Pirates. He kept more to a gridded panel format versus the more open-ended formats that some of the other artists use. The third great artist of the comic strips who influenced the generation of comic book artists who came after was Alex Raymond, who created Flash Gordon. And it was Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon, if you look at that middle top panel in the late 1930s, that influenced, perhaps you've heard of him, this little character, that really kicks off the comic book. And tying in superhero art to comic book art is what happened in the beginning. Joe Shuster, the artist, that Superman symbol was originally supposed to be a police badge because the early work that Shuster did with his partner Jerry Siegel, Slam Bradley for early DC Comics, was a knockoff of the other great adventure strip of the day, Dick Tracy. Chester Gould brought in a more cartoony look to his art as opposed to the realism of the great three of Foster, Caniff, and Raymond. In this golden age of the comic strip, you had artists like Cliff Sterritt and Polly and her pals who experimented with the graphic form because they had a more cartoony style. Frank King, who did the strip Gasoline Alley, used the grid of the comic book page to show an entire scene that you would read panel by panel as a separate scene. Frank King, who experimented with pulling in fine art elements into the comic strip. But after the 1930s, the worlds of fine art and comic book art were distinct from each other, and comic strip art as well. It wasn't until 1956 that an English artist named Richard Hamilton created this really small collage. That image is about this big, and it's a collage, not a painting, made up of advertising images and pieces that an American artist friend of his sent him to England. And it's considered the first pop art piece of art, not really a painting. It's called pop art because of the giant Tootsie Pop that the weightlifter is holding in the center. But if we look closely in the center there, what do we see but a young romance comic from the 1950s? So comic book art and pop art were linked right from the start. Young Romance was created by the team of Joe Simon, who was a writer and an inker and an artist himself, and that's Jack Kirby there. 10 years before, here they're shown working for DC Comics in 1940, doing a boy strip called The Boy Commandos. They're a little better known because in the spring of 1941, a year before America goes into World War II, they create Captain America as a way of elevating American consciousness to what was happening in Europe. Because America was isolationist at the time. They didn't want to fight Europe's war. So they create Captain America. He becomes an overnight sensation. The very first image, of course, he's punching Hitler. And then in the 1950s, Simon and Kirby get together on their own, and they create overnight the entire genre of romance comics. This is the house ad from 1950 that the Richard Hamilton got that Young Romance comic for his pop art painting. After Kirby left Simon, he teams up with the writer and editor Stan Lee in the late 1950s. They go on to create a bunch of monster comics with names like Fin Fang Foom. But then in 1961, they co-create the foundation comic of the Silver Age and of modern comics with the first issue of the Fantastic Four. The interesting thing about 1961, the year this appeared, is that earlier in the spring, a young commercial artist designed a couple of window displays for the department store Bonwit Teller, and that artist's name was Andy Warhol. He made paintings like this, based on comic book panels that looked like this. That is the artist Kurt Schaffenberger, who did Lois Lane for about 20 years for DC Comics. You know, that one cover will tell you everything you need to know about how DC approached women, sex. Yeah, I see you're laughing over there. I know what. But we love Kurt Schaffenberger because he is not only one of the great Superman artists, but you can't think of Lois Lane without thinking of Kurt Schaffenberger. And it's his Superman that Warhol used. And you can see in this poster of a recent retrospective, they still go back to this image as a part of Warhol's early career. At the same time, in the spring of '61, he's taking images like this, which are paintings of the Batman logo. The closest comic book I could find to that year was the year before this issue, which had that red Batman logo, which maybe Warhol used in his piece. You can see in a modern retrospective, once again, he still returns to these early comic book and comic strip paintings. He also did comic strip people like Dick Tracy and Popeye. Well, right after he did these in the spring of '61, an artist friend of his invites him over to the studio of a young painter that was on the rise. His name was Roy Lichtenstein. And he had paintings like this of Popeye and Mickey Mouse. Well, these were before he became more well known for the comic strip paintings. But Warhol took one look at that Popeye and the Mickey Mouse and said, you know, this guy's doing comic strips better than I'm doing. And that's why Warhol went on to do these images like the Campbell soup can and the Brillo boxes with that cold silkscreen look. But years passed, Warhol never lost his love for comics. In the wake of the Batman TV show in '66, he did a spread for Esquire magazine where he dresses up as Robin and Nico is Batman. In the '70s, he does one of his Superman silkscreens, which appeared in the Museum of Modern Art's retrospective catalog in 1989, 2 years after Warhol died. Well, in that catalog, I noticed small collages, not paintings. These were about 11 by 14 inches, and they're using comic book panels that are pasted on canvas, splattered with some watercolor paint, and they're dated 1960. Now look at this one. Comic book panel, same thing, signed and dated 1960. Well, there's only one problem with this when I took a look at these. I remember reading Superman back in the 60s. You see those panels? That's from a comic book from 1969. So explain to me how a collage could have possibly been made in 1960 using panels from 1969. I contacted a friend of mine, comic book fan and historian, and his sister worked for the San Francisco Chronicle, and they wrote this story about it. I produced this piece of artwork where I tried to get the New York art world to see that in the catalog raisonné of the greatest painter of the 20th century after Picasso maybe, Andy Warhol, are fraudulent collages. But this is part of the problem with the way the straight world and the museum world looks at comics. Whoever made those forgeries, and if you know about Warhol's career, he had his mother signing his artwork. So maybe one of his factory stooges made those collages thinking, nobody's going to know the difference if I'm using a comic book panel from 1969. He dated them 1960 because they would be worth more money if they were actually created when Warhol was doing those early comic strip paintings. So I took it as a sign of the problem that lectures like mine and books like mine are trying for my whole career to erase, is the basic condescension and ignorance that the straight media world, the museum world, has for comics. Getting back to Lichtenstein, there's a shot of him in his studio in 1965. That's a DC comic book panel by Tony DiPreta, and that's what Lichtenstein did to turn it into a painting. Here's one of Lichtenstein's most famous paintings. And here is the Irv Novick DC comic book panel that it was made from. There's an entire website called Deconstructing Roy Lichtenstein, which is all about giving credit to the original comic strip artist that Lichtenstein made his paintings from. And a lot of comic book people think all Lichtenstein did was take these images and trace them off of comic book panels. Well, a simple side-by-side exploration should really demonstrate to you that, like a great graphic designer, Lichtenstein did more than just trace his panels. He recomposed these elements and painted them freshly. Look at the difference in sound effects. In everything about these two, there is no way that is a straight copy. But most critics of Lichtenstein to this day don't give him the credit for turning comic book panels, changing their context from an anonymous panel in a 24-page story in a 10-set comic book into a giant museum wall the size of this projection screen. Look at this painting that he's most known for, 1963's Image Duplicator. Well, if you look at this issue of Doom Patrol by DC Comics in the same year, and look at that panel in the middle right, well, there's your Roy Lichtenstein Image Duplicator. But where did he get the kind of red mask from? Well, the same year Jack Kirby's and Stan Lee's X-Men debuted, and there's their Dr. Doom, the villain, Magneto. And when you combine that, there you have your Lichtenstein Image Duplicator. Marvel Comics' identification in the 60s with pop art was so great because of the Lichtenstein connection that for a brief time in 1965, a couple months, Marvel in their upper left corner logo box had this little phrase that they were pop art productions. That wasn't the last time Magneto was seen outside of comic books. This is a single put out by Paul McCartney and Wings. And for the younger people out there, that was the band Paul McCartney was in after the Beatles. Well, and if you don't know the Beatles, well, we'll talk about that later. But yeah, here's a shot from a 1974 Paul McCartney and Wings concert. There is Linda McCartney on the right. There's Paul at the keyboards. That art is not actually by Jack Kirby, that's by George Tuska, but all of the Marvel artists after Kirby, more or less, were working in Kirby's bold, dynamic style. But McCartney was a big fan of Jack Kirby. Here he is after the show, giving Kirby a cake to thank him. Now it's interesting because you can look at Lennon McCartney in the 60s as the Lee and Kirby of rock and roll, or you can look at Lee and Kirby as the Lennon McCartney of rock and roll, because what they did for comics was similar in the 60s to what the Beatles did for rock and roll. In fact, 3 years before this image appeared in 1964, right when Fantastic Four #1 was about to be published, Martin Goodman, the publisher, didn't like the title that Lee originally chose, which was the Fabulous Four. He had him change it to the Fantastic Four. Had Martin Goodman not stuck his nose in, the Fantastic Four would have been the first Fab Four 3 years before the Beatles. This is a double-page spread from my Silver Age book. Now the Beatles, like a lot of the early rock and roll artists, were comic book fans. I mean, there's Paul McCartney reading a Jimmy Olsen comic. They didn't read sheet music, but they obviously read comics. Maybe they used comics for inspiration. John Lennon, this is from a photo shoot in the mid-60s. Here he is at the same keyboard with a lineup of DC Comics. I mean, you tell me, were comics an inspiration for some of the greatest rock and roll ever produced? They were obviously DC comic fans as well. That's a typical Mort Weisinger era DC comic that they probably read. That's from 1960. If we go up close, what do we see here but the inspiration for the third early great pop artist who used comics named Mel Ramos. But again, if you look at his version, even though Superman's just standing still, I see it as kind of flaccid. Compared to the Curt Swan original, even standing still, you felt the grace and the power of his Superman. Curt Swan, the baby boomer Superman. This is the Superman we think of when an entire generation thinks of Superman. There's a nobility, there's a grace there that you don't see. In Curt Swan's greatest work, there's almost a Rockwellian look to his work, a very all-American kind of thing. And yet at the same time, when you see an image like this, I think of the 14th Station of the Cross. This is a modern version for a Catholic Church in Philadelphia based on the Great Bronze Doors by Ghiberti. But that's what I see when I see that image. Ramos did other comic book characters, and his idea to differentiate himself with Lichtenstein and Warhol, who were very flat in their painting, was to make the painting very textural. Here's a shot of one of his exhibits, and he painted other commercial pop icons. If you come down the hallway from that exhibit, what do we have here but a painting called The Trickster? Now, The Trickster was recently put up for auction by Bonhams, and I think it fetched somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000. But where did Mel Ramos get this image of The Trickster from? That comes from a cover of a Carmine Infantino Flash comic from 1963. All Ramos really did was change it from a fishing pole to some jewels. I feel Lichtenstein was much more transformative in what he did with his panels. Ramos, of the three, Warhol and Lichtenstein, really didn't change the art the most. Infantino, of course, was the great Flash artist. Out of all the characters he's associated with at DC Comics, which I've ghosted behind the type here on the right, it's the Flash that he's most connected with because it was his depictions of speed on a two-dimensional plane that to this day have gone unduplicated. They're almost like graphic icons for motion. Infantino said every issue he had to come up with another way of portraying motion. When I see that image on the left, I think of this famous painting by Marcel Duchamp from 1912 called Nude Descending a Staircase, which is considered one of the greatest examples of motion on a two-dimensional flat plane. Well, I feel that way about Carmine Infantino's two-dimensional depictions of motion on a flat plane. Just as beautiful as Hokusai's Great Wave at Kawananga. And this is something, an image you've seen, and I find the Infantino Flash just as beautiful and just as evocative as that great painting. I love Infantino's suburban, modern, early 60s homes right out of the California modern architecture of the day. And if you look at interior designers of the day, it's echoed in Infantino's interior designs. This character, his name is Adam Strange. He puts on that costume and goes to this planet Ron and has these interplanetary adventures drawn by Carmine Infantino and inked by his partner, Murphy Anderson. I love images like this because when I think of these figures of Infantino, he never drew the muscle-bound, steroided out comic character that you see everywhere out there. Infantino's figures were lean and long, and there's almost a feminine grace to Infantino's drawing of Adam Strange here. When I asked him about it, when I interviewed him in 1999, I said, Carmine, who was your influence to do figures like this? He said, well, I love Modigliani's figures because they were long and elongated. And you can see in this image echoed in an Infantino Adam Strange panel. Look at this image of Adam Strange suspended in space. He said Degas was an influence on his work, and you can see that even though the image is frozen, you can feel the motion. At the same time, a panel like this by Infantino that I just love, he said was influenced by a Chinese painter named Chai Chen, who would paint landscapes and put a tiny figure somewhere in the landscape. Speaking of landscapes, look at this beautiful, sensitive image by Infantino Anderson. This panel is like 2.5 inches big in the comic book. But when you blow it up like this, and my dream one day is to have an IMAX screen behind me and an audience like Martin Luther King's '63 speech, because these images presented that size, you don't need to repaint them like Lichtenstein, just present them as is, Ben-Day dots and all. At the same time, look at Infantino's vision of futuristic architecture. Very unique and stylized, again, very different from what was happening over at Marvel Comics with the work of this guy. This is the last panel in the very first Spider-Man story. It's maybe the size of a postage stamp. Of course, that's by the great artist Steve Ditko. When I look at that image blown up this big, it reminds me of the German Expressionist movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. If anybody's seen that, I think they just released a kind of a DVD remastered version of it. But that's what I see when I look at some of Ditko's art. Of course, he's much more well known for his action adventure strip Spider-Man, and the costume design may be the most creative costume in the history of comics. It's that costume that was so beautifully translated by the films that made Spider-Man come to life and really kick off the success of the movies we have today. And the reason why Spider-Man is such a success is because of that design by Steve Ditko, which is basically the logo of Marvel Comics, as much of a logo as the Mickey Mouse ears are to Disney. Yeah, meditate on this image for a while. The other great character Ditko creates in Marvel is Doctor Strange, master of the mystic arts. If you were reading comics in 1963, this is the image you saw about a young doctor and his aged mentor. If you were watching television, you saw a young doctor and his aged mentor in Ben Casey. This is how comics were years ahead of the rest of the American culture to this day. The interdimensional worlds Ditko created influenced an entire generation that later became the psychedelic rock and roll poster school. This was one of the first rock and roll posters for the Doors in 1967. Every one of the psychedelic artists credited images like this by Steve Ditko for the psychedelic art they were producing. Look at how this image so perfectly echoes the very first legal LSD festival in January of 1966. Ken Kesey would run these acid tests where people would drop LSD. But look who's in the center there. Yeah, that's Jack Kirby's Thor. The early counterculture loved the Marvel Comics characters because they were super anti-heroes. Thor had his father, the regal Odin. That's where I got Kirby's Pietà from, which to me, if you show it to the aliens, along with this image, without 500 years of art history telling them one was better than the other, I think they would think, hey, two good images of an Earth parent mourning their dead child. Kirby would reach into antiquity for images like this to make his images of Thor that look like this. He would also reach into the current culture, like the sword and sandals epics of Hercules, and turn him into his Hercules. Kirby's characters were godlike. They were men, but they were also gods at the same time, epitomized by Black Bolt. They were as much man as they were machine. And the machines had a life to them that couldn't possibly exist in the real world, yet existed on the two-dimensional page. Something about Kirby's metalwork, his machinery, his Kirby tech was his own. It predates the era of the computer chip and the computer grid. I look at Kirby's designs, which are purely abstract technology. I see Louise Nevelson's sculptural boxes. I see that echoed in a Kirby cityscape that looked like this. There's a professor up in Massachusetts that teaches comic book art history, and he compares this image to a Piranesi city, a tiered city that looks like this. He compared Kirby's machinery here from Fantastic Four to the violent energy in a Franz Klein. Look at this Franz Klein over this classic Kirby image of destruction. When you strip it down into its black and white form, I see in this mess of debris and detritus where Kirby grew up in the crumbling tenements of the Lower East Side. This is a self-portrait he did back in 1990, 4 years before he died. Somehow out of this cacophony of visual clutter, of destruction in a way, of a crumbling tenement, you've got the guy that could also create without a college education, I mean, who taught from the streets. Where did he come up with this? Well, some of the inspiration for his images actually came from outer space. This is the first photograph of a quasar printed in National Geographic in 1965. Kirby was an avid reader of magazines like that, Popular Mechanics, and that's where he got what became known as Kirby Crackle, that first debuts in his most godlike character, Galactus, in 1966. A year later, Kirby creates this image of Dr. Doom and really codifies the Kirby Crackle that has become a graphic standard for generations of comic artists wanting to delineate energy in pen and ink. That image comes from this full-page image with the Silver Surfer lining the feet. I consider this image to be the greatest image of victory and defeat in a single image in not only the history of comic art, but I think in the history of art itself. And it's interesting that in current artworks, artists are now painting figures like Dr. Doom in a fine art context. But again, Kirby's most godlike character was Galactus, seen in this full page. And as the years went on in the 60s, Kirby became more and more abstract with his godlike characters, to the point where in 1970 he released a portfolio called Kirby's Gods. And in these images, which were black and white pen and ink, it's a little abstract, but there's God's face there in the beard in the upper left corner. You can really get a sense of what Kirby felt about God and his creation, Earth. There's God looking on, and Earth is a jumble of violent, graphic imagery. In fact, in another plate,